What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Going to be getting into this video here on the mindset of guitar, essentially the philosophy of guitar, which I adapted over from the philosophical works of Epictetus. 20 years ago, I went through a life crisis, a life calamity. Oh man, and let me tell you, that just set off like a decade of just misstep after misstep after misstep after misstep, and failure after failure after failure. And obviously after a decade of that, of just getting my ass absolutely handed to me, it started to affect me mentally, like really badly. And so I was desperate, desperate for anything. I was like not very religious and whatnot, even though I appreciate the whole religious thing. I'm just not much of a people person, right? So going to church doesn't really appeal to me because I'm not social. And that's kind of like the central factor there. But I was still hungry to learn something, right? So just on a whim, I kind of went to the library, which is right around the corner from where I live here, and essentially was walking through the philosophy section. I was actually looking for Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So I was just like, well, it's right there in the title. Maybe that's what we need. But the librarian's like, well, you should check out this other guy, Epictetus, and we have him right now because Meditations is out. And it's a short book. It's like 80 pages or something. This slave that was freed and became like this, basically the godfather of Stoicism, or at least the first real incarnation, the real sort of thought leader with respect to this philosophy. So I quickly realized that you can adapt over these basic life principles to the learning, sort of the skill of learning, I should say, not just the learning process, but the skill of learning. This is how you acquire that skill. You sort of set boundaries. And you can set boundaries by applying these sort of basic life rules instead of it being a macro thing like, oh, what should I do today? It's more like when you're practicing guitar, you're like now focusing it down to just this set of skills, right? So that right there is incredibly important. Training the mind and syncing it up with the technicality and the physicality of actually playing the instrument without the ability to string ideas together quickly. You're obviously going to run into a bit of a situation there as far as the playing part is concerned. So that's why it's of utmost importance. You have to develop both at the same time. It's not like you have a choice. You have to. And I did the same thing, and I made an analogy one time. I remember, this is back before the dark times, when I'd spent hours and hours and hours learning tons of scale shapes and arpeggios and all the rest of this and chord sequences. But every time I improvised, I'm like, it doesn't sound like the guys that I'm listening to on the internet that are amazing. It doesn't even, not even as good as the guys in the 80s where technically I'm better. I can play faster and more flashy stuff in certain instances, but it's nowhere near as cool as that. So there's a serious problem here, big disconnect. And I remember I was putting together this horrendous IKEA piece of furniture. I think it was a dresser or something like that. And I'd taken everything apart and basically stacked it into the appropriate sort of piles with the hardware and the shelves and this and the drawers or whatever it was. And the thing is like I was sitting there looking at all these piles, and that's when it hit me. I'm like, this is like my guitar learning right here. I know the scales, I know the arpeggios and this, that, and everything else. But what I don't have is the instructions here in my hand. I don't know how to take these things and basically apply them to the guitar. And then there's a secondary problem that's even bigger and more insidious, which is this one. You can't think like a musician. That took me like 25 years to figure out, that you have to actually develop this skill, if you will, of thinking like a musician so that you can express yourself more eloquently on the instrument. And that's really what this comes down to. So we're going to look at the 10 basic tenets, if you will, of Epictetus, as I've sort of summed them up here. And then start to think about them with respect to the guitar not just always in terms of life. And we're going to talk about some examples. Let's get into it. All right, tenets 1 and 2 here are basically focus on what you can control and accept what you cannot. So during the dark days, basically I was fighting these battles that I had no hope of winning because I had no real control over the situation. I was just a pawn. So that I expended all this extra energy and whatnot and depleted myself mentally and emotionally to the point of basically flatline, right? So I only hurt my own cause, if you will. So the lesson here is that I learned when it came to learning guitar and whatnot that at the beginning and even in the middle stages, you have to really focus on the things that you're good at and you're interested in. For me, it was like playing fast, being flashy, and doing a lot of improvisations. I didn't want to actually, learn can licks or figure out solos or whatever else it is. I just wanted to figure out the techniques behind the solos and then just make my own solos that sounded like those solos, the ones that I like. So that was the basic mindset. And so I really did concentrate on it, and I got that far, right? But then, of course, I was sounding too much like a clone. And it was a little unfocused because I didn't actually understand deeply the music principles. I was just, again, paint by numbers kind of, but a little bit more advanced because I had more time in the trenches. And that was just it. I had to accept at a certain point that certain aspects that were outside my control, like my ability to marry up my fretboard knowledge with basic music theory and music concepts, was holding me back as a musician. Right? So I had to make a fundamental change there to be like, well, you have this theoretical background and you have the playing skills and you understand the fretboard. So you got to basically marry all those three things up to maximize the results. And once I did do that, boom. And the other thing was, of course, is I'm hopeless at certain techniques. So again, I had to accept that I'm never going to be able to do these particular techniques, these triple hybrid things where you do triad pairs. It sounds so amazing, but no. My brain is like, nah, forget it. I mean, I know what I'm supposed to do, but once I try to get it up to speed, it's just game over. So I had to sort of abandon the idea for right now and just work on one finger. Again, focus on the one thing I can control, which is just try to get the picking and the plucking part up. And that's getting a little bit better, but still it's a long road, right? You got to be really into the chicken picking, and it takes like 10 or 15 years to get quite good at a technique, and that's just the way it goes. So don't spend any unnecessary time either, focusing in on things you can't really control, like playing techniques that are way beyond your skill level or trying to absorb music that is just way beyond what you can actually do. Instead, lower your expectations and set the bar realistically so that you hit there first towards this goal. It's not the be all end all, but you make realistic steps. And you're like, okay, I'm ready to go up the next one. And when you do that, obviously, you get much better results because you actually attain your goal. You play the song, and then boom, it's on to the next milestone. Next. All right, the next tenet here is basically cultivating self-discipline. Obviously, when my life was going to absolute hell and the darkest times were there, music reached out like a friend. It's all I had, honestly. And in those moments, I was realizing two things. Number one, that if I kept going on the current path, I was just going to lose everything. So I needed to make changes. So I needed to exercise some self-discipline to make the moves in the real world. And then I was playing more guitar to try to basically drown out the real world by just throwing myself fully into this other activity, if you will. But then I was like, if I'm not actually exercising any self-discipline with respect to my learning arc, I'm just throwing everything at the wall and hoping certain amounts of the pasta will stick. but it's not in a controlled methodology, so the information may or may not stick. I mean, it'll be stuck back there in the back of my mind, but I may not think about it for like 4 years. What good is that? Right? So this idea is that you have to exercise self-discipline in a whole bunch of different aspects of your training regime with learning new music concepts, learning new music theory concepts, music concepts like in terms of songwriting and like modal interchange and all of that stuff. And then, of course, bringing new techniques, right? Learning them with respect to the picking and whatnot, 3-in-1, sweeping, whatever it is. And then, of course, after that, you have to basically always be sort of regimenting things where you're setting goals and whatnot, right? Being disciplined enough to set the goal and then work towards that goal methodically so you hit this plateau and be like, okay, I'm ready to take on the next one. By doing that, eventually it goes from these steps to being like this gradual arc. And then all of a sudden you start picking up speed, and it's not necessarily about going up. It's just about going in the same kind of direction, but much, much faster. And then when you play your ideas, when you play the instrument for yourself, because of all of this invested self-discipline to sort of really break down the mechanics, to understand the music, to use basic music principles to guide your playing, you just blow it out of the water. That's how it works. Without this sort of guiding principle, the mind, the mechanical stuff is just that. It sort of comes off sounding mechanical, and you've all heard it before. So that's the difference. When you hear that, it's like a person's a good player, but their music knowledge is weak. And when you hear a person that has great technique, but also their ideas are absolutely killer too, a Guthrie kind of thing, well, that's because they have absolutely phenomenal music knowledge too. So which one do you want to be? And which one has more fun, obviously? Done. Next. All right, next on the list here is practice virtue as the highest good. And now listen, that can mean a whole bunch of stuff with respect to justice and honor and these big sort of ticket things, your moral compass, your ethics, if you will. Your integrity. But with respect to music, what we're talking about here is wisdom. You can practice for years and still fail at being able to execute a specific technique, but you could learn some sort of basic music principle and understand deeply its wisdom and use that in a myriad of other ways that would make your playing just as impressive, which means now you've created again this situation where you're losing traction and you're wasting time, which is like a sail dragging your sailboat backwards, right? You've got the normal sails and stuff, but all of a sudden now there's this new chute behind you, like a parachute that's creating drag, slowing you down because you keep investing it there, because you keep investing energy into it, maintaining the rope. You just got to cut it and let it go, and then come back to it later if you come back to it at all. And that's just it. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions, and I don't think people understand that. So the wisdom of playing guitar, the wisdom of understanding music is far greater than the actual sort of technical skill set. Because later on you're going to get old and you won't play as much, and your hands will get arthritis or whatever else if you've been playing a lot. It happens to everybody. You just start breaking down. But if you've invested into music and stuff like that, with the tools we have with computers and whatnot, and a keyboard, you can keep making music forever and ever and ever and ever, and keep being creative and do things that you never even thought possible. And that's just it. If you're getting into music right now, the medium is guitar. But in the back of your mind, you should be like, I should expand this out to some basic keyboard principles, and I should understand some basic percussion and rhythm aspects of music. And once you start, again, accumulating this sort of more global picture about how music interacts with these various other global elements like rhythm, the drums and stuff, or accompaniment like the bass or keyboards. You know, being a lyricist, being a songwriter by arranging like the intro, the verses, the choruses, the bridges, and all the rest of that stuff. That all comes from wisdom, experience, and the best of the best of the best basically have an insane amount of that. Look at the Beatles, probably ostensibly the most musically diverse band that's ever walked the earth, and probably one of the most celebrated. And you can just see the sheer spread of their music genius across so many different genres with so many different tapestries. It's just mind-blowing. You're just like, wow, man, these guys never stayed in the same place for very long. Just boom. And they wrote hundreds of songs, hundreds. And at least 25 of them are almost instantly recognizable by almost anybody. Like at least 5 are recognizable anywhere in the world. You could play these songs anywhere in the world in a relatively civilized place where they have stuff like that, and they would recognize it. So there it is, right? It's the wisdom that they accrued with respect to writing memorable songs and stringing chord sequences together and all the rest of that stuff that made their music so impactful, especially considering the cultural movement. Take those two things together, legendary. Next. All right, the next two are basically reframe adversity as opportunity and guard your judgments. Basically turn a negative into positive and don't be overly critical about your progress when it comes to music, right? So the first one is just the process of learning the instrument itself in music can be emotionally and mentally draining because it's hard to hit those early plateaus where you can string some chords together, play some scales, maybe even improvise or whatever it is, or string a couple licks together, or play a riff from your favorite song. So you got to start to, essentially learn how to turn a negative into a positive to effectively be like, well, am I making forward progress? You're like, well, yeah, before I couldn't play at all. Now at least I'm kind of closer. Right, and then, of course, using some of the other tenets by focusing in on the things that you can actually control, you can be like, well, what about what I'm doing here is causing me to not be able to nail this lick or this riff or whatever it is? It's the picking? Is it the fingerings? Am I struggling with the sequence of notes? What is it? And there it is. You have all of the skill sets now basically converging on this one small problem, and that's how you should be thinking, and that's why this upper echelon mindset stuff is so important, because you're not given the problem-solving skills to basically do things like that, which is why people just, again, hit it again and again and again, but they'll do the same wrong thing 50 times in a row, like start with a downstroke. If they just started with an upstroke, which would be counterintuitive to them, they're like, I always start with a downstroke. I do it so much that it's actually unconscious. I always start with a downstroke. And I never actually stop to be like, if I started with an upstroke, okay, that works out a lot easier for me. And if I incorporate in this economy picking, that makes it even easier. Right, so now all of a sudden you see all of, again, these elements converging, the mindset, the ability to use critical thinking skills, the dissecting of it to synchronize up with technique and with physicality. Okay, so that's why you got to turn the negative part of being like, okay, well, it's going to be a tough slog to get up the hill. But then once you get up the hill, of course, you're good to go and it's smooth sailing, right? So you got to focus in on what it is that you can actually do and control and break the situation down and be disciplined enough to do things like that. And that minimizes the adversity part and maximizes the beneficial aspects to your guitar playing. as far as the, guard your judgments and whatnot, just don't be overly critical. Give yourself time. It takes years to do certain things. A lot of people expect to be done in like 2 weeks or 6 months or whatever it is. It's completely unfeasible. You start practicing it and then you just don't stop. And hopefully after 5 years, you're pretty badass at it. So there it is, right? That's quite literally all there is to it. And the more you practice it and the more you sort of integrate it into your everyday playing, the better you'll get at it, right? So again, you have to sort of keep the mindset healthy. Don't go into an overly critical stage where you start berating yourself and be like, you're suck or you're terrible. Don't be, too lenient either and be like, oh yeah, no, it's okay if you skip out on leg day. No. On alternate picking day. No. That's where you got to get the old, I can't even remember the word now. I got to look. The self-discipline. I totally blanked there. Nice. Leaving it in the video, by the way. That's where you got to work up the self-discipline to be like, I got to actually work on this stuff. Okay, so that's the next two. Let's move on to the next set. All right, this next one here is a triple whammy. So the first one is live in accordance with nature. Then it's practice negative visualizations. And the last one is love your fate. So the first one is live in accordance with nature. Basically accept balance, night and day, water and fire, earth and air, right? There are other ways of sort of expressing balance too, like your expectation of growth as a player versus how much you actually practice. Your ability to create interesting and memorable improvisations is relative to your actual music theory and understanding of basic music concepts. So you have to reconcile this concept of balance. And obviously you can't overly concentrate on technical elements while neglecting the more cerebral ones and vice versa. So again, you're into a balanced situation. So that's live in accordance with nature, right? Live, and I guess understand music is like the sea. Right, so a skilled captain with basically an indestructible vessel would be able to survive almost any situation. But a less skilled captain, not so much. You're going to get swept out to sea, right? And sometimes the sea is nice and calm and it's beautiful and it's smooth sailing, and other times it's pretty rough and choppy. So you have to be prepared for those situations. But that really sort of gets to the heart of the matter right there of the nature aspect of it. Is nature's unpredictable, but also the balance of time invested versus the expectation of the skill acquired on the other side. And really that's the big one with respect to guitar. Next is this practice negative visualizations. This one is a little strange, I suppose you could say. In my mind, what they're talking about here is expect the worst, but prepare, or, expect the best, but prepare for the worst there. Oh, you know how it is. So, try to put yourself or visualize yourself in the worst possible situation. Like all of a sudden your effects pedal dies. And there's no reverb, there's no delay, there's nothing. It's just you going through the amp now, dry, with nothing to hide anything, right? There's a prime example. This is one of the big ones that I'm sort of tailoring it to a common sin on the internet with people just layering their guitar playing in like mountains of effects to sort of cover over the fact that it's not that great. But with the effects, it definitely takes it up several notches. So it's better to sort of practice with no effects so that when you do practice with effects or play with them, at least in a live gigging situation, it just sounds that much better. And again, you're getting a more accurate representation of your actual skill level, right? So I'll leave that one there. And last but not least is Love Your Fate. Basically, I love and hate being a musician. I love it because it's the thing that gives me the most joy in my entire life. That's always been there for me, even when it was like the worst of the worst times. It has been my saving grace. But at the same time, I hate it because, you know, we're lower than low on the social totem pole, if you will. So, you know, people don't care about us. We're like irrelevant. They'd care as soon as there was no more music. But of course, the way things are going, it's going to be pretty dark days ahead, right? So we can't get really any recognition. There's no real viability with respect to getting signed by a record company or having a career or any of the old days kind of stuff. Those days are just long gone. So, you know what I mean? You have to be into it for the music kind of situation. And that's really my embodiment of the love your fate kind of thing is it's just, listen, if you're going to be attracted to music, then just be satisfied playing music in your room, playing the backing tracks, going to the, you know, you're at the local jam or whatever, going to the local open mic, I should say, sorry. And there it is. You're done, right? That you don't have to make it about being a rock star. I don't even think about that nonsense anymore. I make music because I love making music. I'm going to do it anyways. And so that's just it. I love the music part of it. And now that I've actually reconciled that, I've begun to love my fate. I've found a renewed interest in my music stuff and just the creative process. And it's that much more fun. And now that my recording chops are getting up to a level that are significantly higher and a much better quality, well, who knows what can be produced in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's just it. You know what I mean? Like the sky's the limit. And that is very reassuring to me that I've opened up a whole new avenue to express myself musically, not just on the guitar or having to go play live. I can just release music or even just do full live jams live streamed on the internet using a DAW and triggering and stuff like that. So, and I'm actually thinking about doing stuff like that where it's more ambient based stuff. So again, you see what I mean? You have to learn to adapt to the environment that's provided for you. And that comes from you thinking outside the box, applying some of those other ones, focusing in on the things you can control. I have an internet connection. I have a keyboard. I have access to a DAW. I can basically do all this stuff. I have a computer that's probably good enough that can actually run it all at the same time. So it's up to you, right? All right, let's get into the last tenet. Reflect daily and practice. All right, lucky number 10 here is reflect and practice daily. Now, obviously, the practice daily, practice makes perfect, but the reflection part is obviously integral. Notice how those two things are together. So when you're practicing, you're reflecting on what you're actually doing. You're thinking about what you're doing. Did I play that properly? Could I have cleaned up the picking? Did I fret it properly? How were the hammer-ons and pull-offs? After you just played this lick, do you be like, how good was that? And then do it again. You know, or you just mindlessly do it again and again and again, thinking, oh yeah, no, if I just repeat it 6 million times, it'll get better. Or you're like, if I kind of slow down a bit here and then speed up, it sounds a lot more interesting. If I add a bend here, sounds way better. If I start off here with hammer-ons and pull-offs, it's easier, but then move into alternate picking, it kind of changes up the mood and it sounds really awesome. Job's done. You see what I mean? Are you actually having any sort of thoughtful dialogue with respect to what you're actually doing on the fretboard? That's another way of describing this principle of reflection. That's another one. When you're practicing something, are you actually like, should I have started with a downstroke or an upstroke there? You play it and you kind of botch it. Do you just try to play it again and botch it again 50 times? Or do you stop and reflect and be like, what if I start with an upstroke, and then you do, and you're like, it's a little awkward at first, but honestly, the picking pattern works out way better. You see what I'm getting at there? It's sometimes just something as easy as that turns the tide and changes essentially you practicing this one thing for years and years and years and just consistently getting it wrong, I guess, to just making this one tiny fundamental change. And then over the span of 3 or 4 months, having the self-discipline to be like, I should always start these kind of runs with an upstroke, and then boom. The issue is conquered, plus you've added a new tool. Just starting a run with an upstroke is actually kind of weird for most people. So it's an actual skill that you got. You can just be like, and there it is. You're off to the races, right? So that's very important. So don't ever do anything where you're just basically kind of going through the motions. Invest the time while you're practicing, and then practice regularly, obviously, is to reflect on what it is that you're actually doing, both in the moment and then after the fact. If you're not walking away from your practice sessions going like, nailed it kind of thing. If you feel like you're kind of going through the Friday night run through, same diff. It's up to you to sort of dig deep and really find within the self the the inner fortitude to really just look in that mirror, to look at the Dorian Gray painting and just accept the ugly truth about a lot of things about your playing that you already know, but you've kind of swept under the carpet like I did. And just get it out in the open and be like, okay, let's just start right here. Be like, I skipped over this because the first time I tried it, I failed miserably and it really discouraged me. But I clearly see now that this is going to be beneficial to me. So maybe I need to just dial back my expectations and start at the starting area and sort of get some basic research done and then move on from there. And that's really all it takes. And of course, that kind of gets to the essential stuff. If you're trying to absorb this more advanced technique, but you actually haven't absorbed the lower level sort of foundational information, obviously you're going to run into a major level roadblock. So that's why it's so important to be able to have good critical thinking skills to recognize that kind of stuff, to be like, if I were to dial it back to this previous topic, musically speaking, and start to work on that, then I'll quickly graduate up to where I am right now by just absorbing this new information, and that'll make everything make sense. And boom, off to the races you go. Like if somebody just learns a dominant 7 arpeggio at the Locrian position, but they don't know it's dominant 7 and they don't know it's the Locrian position. It's just, oh, if I move a half step down from the major scale, I can play this arpeggio shape and it sounds cool. Just like that. You see what I'm saying? And they might be satisfied with that and go on doing stuff like that for years and years and years, just because it does sound cool in almost every instance. And of course, it works out diatonically. But the second you actually know how that works, you're like, oh, look, there's another one here at Dorian, and then at Lydian, and then again at Mixolydian. So that's kind of useful, right? I can create a whole sequence there. Oh, look, I can pair it up with the 1 chord. Mint, now I got my perfect cadence, and you're off to the races. And that's why, again, this reflectivity with respect to what you're doing is so important. And to, of course, exercise all the other 10 tenets. Try to find a thought process where you start to bring these into the, the metaphorical mental conversation you have with yourself when you're actually practicing, to be like, have that inner dialogue where you're like, what am I doing? What should I be working on? What are my goals? You don't have to be crazy and write them all down and have a journal and all the rest of this stuff and a candle that you burn, No. Instead, just in the moment when you're playing, be like, oh, I'm going to work on pentatonic stuff. Then really focus in on what you're doing. Where's the flattened third? Start with that. If you're like, I already know the pentatonic scale, I'm going to work on that. Okay, today I'm going to factor in the flattened third. If you're like, Takes you 10 minutes to figure out just the first one. Be like, okay, we got one done today, 1 of 5. Next time we do it, we'll do 1 and 2. And there it is, okay? But of course, in your mind, you should be setting yourself up as far as the practice session to be like, every time I do a practice session, after you just did a practice session, you reflect on it and you're like, every time I do a new practice session, I want to add in something fresh to this piece of information I have, the pentatonic scale. The next thing up the food chain is adding in the flat third to create the blues scale. Done deal. Right. I think that's the end of the video. I know it's a long one and it'll get 15 views, but so be it. If you made it all the way to the end here, I trust me, these things made a fundamental difference in my ability to actually be good at music. And without them, you're just adrift at sea with no compass and no stars. So keep that in mind. I appreciate every single one of you, and I wish you all the best. Organize your thoughts to work in synchronicity with the physicality on the fretboard and your picking hand, and of course, the speed of the idea transfer, where you can come up with the idea up here and quickly play it down here. That is our ultimate goal. See you in the next one.